Welcome back, guys. Today we're going to be talking about
dichotomous keys, or how we classify organisms.
Yeah, so we're going to be learning basically how to use a tool that allows us to identify what something is based on its phenotype, things that we can see. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in.
Okay, so the first question we should ask ourselves is, why do we even need to identify organisms? So let's say that I'm walking through the woods and I have a bunch of different leaves I've collected from different tree species that I'm interested in studying in this forest, and I want to know what they are. What do I do?
Well, here's an example. So let's say we went on our hike today in McIntyre Park.
Right.
And when we went on our hike in McIntyre Park, these were the leaf specimen that we picked up along the trail. Now, so we're back in our lab space, or we're back in our living rooms trying to figure out which one or what types of trees each one of these came from. Well, there are a couple of different options that we can exercise. One is we can go to the library and we can check out a book on trees.
Right. Here's the problem with that, though. I'm going to have my leaf and I'm going to have my book, and I'm going to be flipping through every page of that book. And even if it's a book just about trees in Virginia, it could still be a very, very long book trying to find the tree that looks just like my leaf.
Yeah. I could also potentially use the internet, but then again, we're talking about a lot of time and a lot of energy. Looking at lots of different things. What we want to do is use a tool that really narrows down our options and helps us to quickly and easily and accurately, because we want to be accurate, accurately identify which trees each one of these leaves actually came from.
Okay. So what is that magical tool?
Okay, so the magical tool that we're going to use is something called a
dichotomous key. And so a dichotomous key, you can kind of think of it like a choose your own adventure. Basically what the key does is, actually let's break down this word. The prefix di, what does that mean? Two. And this root in here, this conomous, means choice. Okay? So what's happening in this key is it's going to give you different choices, and specifically, two choices to pick from at each step. And as you make your choices, you're going to get closer and closer and closer to the big finale, which is?
It's going to actually tell you what the organism actually is. Now, the interesting thing about the dichotomous key is that you'll notice that it's numbered along the left-hand side. So we see 1, we see 2, and we see 3. Each one of those numbers corresponds to a specific phenotype or adaptation or trait or variation of a trait that you might see, for instance, in leaves, because that's what we're trying to identify here. And underneath each one of those traits, you'll see 2 options or 2 variants or variations for that. So for instance, if we look at number 1 here on our list, you'll notice that it'll say compound or a simple leaf. Right. Now, so if we look at our options, it says for 1A, compound leaf, meaning that the leaves are divided into tiny leaflets. If that's what our actual leaf looks like, what are we supposed to do, Miss Hines?
We have to follow the directions. So it says go to step 2. So if my leaf had compound leaves, I would jump right down here to step number 2 to continue my adventure. But what if it has simple leaves? Then what do I do?
Well, if it has simple leaves, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look all the way at the end and see what it tells me to do again. And my adventure now tells me that my next set of directions is to go and jump to step 4.
So what this is saying is that I can just skip over steps number 2 and 3. I don't even have to go in order. I can jump right to step number 4.
And the interesting thing is that you're going to keep going on this sort of treasure hunt, going to step 1, going to step 5, whatever it tells you to do, until eventually what's going to happen?
Until eventually what you're going to see is not another direction, but the name of your organism or the species. So for example, let's say that my leaf had a compound leaf, so I go to step 2, and then let's say that all the leaflets were attached at one central point. Okay? What I see is, if that's the case, I don't see a direction here. What I see is a name. I see a scullus or buckeye.
That's right. And so we've identified that particular leaf.
Okay.
All right, so now that we've talked about it some, let's talk about what our actual challenge is today.
Okay, so we have this group of very unusual organisms.
Creatures, yeah.
Yes, and we need to classify them. We know that there's a variety of different species they could be, and so we're going to use the dichotomous key to help us do this. So make sure you follow along, because then you're going to have to classify some of them as well.
Okay, so our goal is to identify all 8 of these creatures that we see in front of us. All right, before we get started, let's review the most important rule to remember when we're working on dichotomous keys. And what is that most important rule, Ms.
The
Himes?
number one rule on dichotomous keys, number one rule, it's very easy to remember, is always start with number one.
So
Okay.
our number one rule, always start with number one. What if I'm trying to identify the third organism on my list?
You still got to start with number one. What
Okay.
about number 100?
Still starting with number one.
Yep.
So if you look at our list on the screen, it's the same list that you guys have in front of you on your notes. So regardless if we're trying to identify creature number 1 or creature number 8, we're always going to start with number 1, and that's how we're going to start our adventure.
And after that point, you might go in a different order depending on what choices you make at each step, but you have to always go back to number 1.
All right, so now that we know what the most important rule is, let's go ahead and dive in and see if we can identify creature number 1.
Okay, here we go. So my most important rule is I'm always going to start with number 1. So I'm going up here and I see that the first choice I have to make is either my creature should have pointed ears or have rounded ears.
So let's study our organism carefully, and we're
Yeah.
looking at the ears. It looks like the ears on this guy are actually pointed. So I'm
Okay.
going to go back up to number 1 where it says has pointed ears, and I'm going to follow it all the way along to the right-hand side. What is our adventure take? Where are we going now on our adventure?
Okay, so I don't see a species name, so I know I'm not done. I see a direction. It says
Right.
go to 3. So I'm going to jump down to step number 3, which I see right here.
Okay, so now that I'm at step number 3, again, I have 2 choices. Dichotomous key, 2 choices.
Right.
So the first choice is ears are pointed upwards or ears are pointed downwards.
Right.
Okay.
And so I would say that this guy, his ears are not really drooping down. Instead,
Right.
they seem pretty perky. So I would say that his ears point upward. So I'm going to make this choice.
Okay.
I'm going to follow it along. And what does it say I need to do?
Now I need to jump over 4, and I'm going directly to number 5.
All right, let's jump down here. Go to 5.
All right, so now for 5, again, I have 2 choices. Engages in waving behavior, so is it waving at us, or does not engage in waving behavior? Let's take a look at our creature.
He doesn't really seem to be waving. He seems a little scared, but
Yeah.
not waving. So we're going to go ahead and say does not engage in waving behavior and look towards the end. So you follow our direction and go to...
Number 6.
All right.
So when I go to number 6, I'm doing the same thing again. I have 2 choices, so I'm going to read over my 2 choices. Has hair on the head or has no hair on head but may have ear tufts.
Well, this creature right here definitely has a nice set of hair on its head. So I'm
Okay.
going to go ahead and make that choice and follow it to the end. But wait,
There are no directions. Instead, we actually see a name. So what does that mean we've finally done?
we've finally identified our species. This species name is Beverless. So we're going to go ahead and write that right below the alien on the paper in the space that says number 1. We're going to write what this species is. And this is really great because if we were scientists trying to find out more, now we could go online and look up this species and find out all the information that's already known to scientists about it.
Yeah, and the other great thing is we still have 7 more of these creatures to identify. Can any of the other creatures be beverless?
Nope, but that's the only one.
So if we end up with beverless again, that tells us we've made a mistake. But the good thing about a dichotomous key is you can always go back to number
1.
and start again and retrace your footsteps.
Okay, so let's do another example together. Okay, so here's creature number 2. So I'm going to start at...
Number 1, it's our
Right.
number 1 rule.
All right, and we're going to go a little bit quicker this time. Let's try it
Okay.
out. So my first choice is...
Has pointed ears or has rounded ears?
I'm looking at my picture. I'm thinking these ears are
Definitely
pretty
pointed.
pointy. I'm going to follow my direction and go.
We're going to 3.
All right, what do I got to do?
Are ears pointed upwards or are they pointed downwards?
These ears are a little bit droopy. They're definitely pointed
Down.
down. So I'm going to make that choice, and I'm going to go to...
Number 4.
All right.
And for number 4, all we have to do is engages in waving behavior or has hairy tufts on the ear. And if I take a look at my image, it clearly this little guy is waving. So we're going to follow it over to the right. And the interesting thing is there's no direction. So what does that
Right.
tell us?
That tells me that I have correctly identified my species as Dallas.
Very nice.
So I'm going to go ahead on the space under number 2 and write the species name Dallas. And again, now that I've used this one, none of the other organisms, unless they look exactly like this one, should be finding that species name.
All right. So let's try one more together and see how we do.
All right, this guy
All
looks a
right.
little mean.
So here's our new organism, but what's our number one rule?
Always start at number 1.
All right, so let's go through quickly. Pointed ears, rounded ears.
Pointy.
Definitely pointy, so it says to go to
3.
So we're jumping down to number 3. Are ears pointed upwards or downwards?
They're pointed
upwards. So it says to go to number
5.
So we're jumping to number 5. Question is it engaging in waving behavior or does it not engage in waving
This
behavior?
guy is not waving.
And so what does it say to do? We're going to jump to 6.
6.
Hair on head or has no hair.
I don't really see much hair
We
on
don't
their
see
head.
any
yeah,
hair
we're gonna
there.
Go down here.
All right, and has a tail or has no tail and is aggressive.
This is definitely looking like an aggressive guy, and I don't see any tail there, so I'm going to choose that. And
Yep. And so we have our organism. It's going to be rageous, so we're going to add it to our line. And so we've now identified 3 of these organisms for you, and now we finally got into your stop and jot.
so your job is to identify the rest of the aliens, and then before you go on to any other dichotomous keys, make sure you call your teacher over to check your answers.
Good luck, guys.